Hey everyone, welcome to episode 20 of the Miami Tech Pod. This one's cool because we're here in person for the first time all together. I'm Cesar Fernandez, of course, joined with Maria Durkee and Brian Breslin. And we have a special guest on the pod this episode. We have Delian Asparouhov from Founders Fund. Delian, welcome to the Miami Tech Pod.
Thanks so much. It's the first podcast I've recorded in person since COVID too, so excited to do it all in person.
That's really neat. It's so much better because I feel like we're all like, you can get better cues on like when to jump in and have conversations when you're in person rather than like, cutting people off. The Zoom delay that we've all kind of like, learn to navigate around. So, Delian, you've had a very cool career in tech and entrepreneurship. Why don't you tell our listeners, kind of walk through the journey a little bit and start at the beginning, and let's go from there till your move to Miami and the famous tweet.
So I grew up in this like sort of Eastern European household with like 2 PhDs, and I always thought that I was going to be like an academic type. Mm-hmm. Wanted to go be like a robotics PhD, go work at JPL. So I went off to MIT to study computer science, and like literally within like the first couple of weeks, like discovered the world of startups and entrepreneurships through a couple of different like angles. This guy Bilal Zuberi, who at the time was at General Catalyst, now is a partner at Lux Capital, sort of ended up meeting with me and telling me a little bit about this whole world and got me interested. And then I basically joined this like kind of like startup club at MIT, where they would just like bring in local founders, like the HubSpot founder and the Kayak founder. Basically, there's not that many tech founders in Boston that have done well, but they would bring them by for dinner and things like that. And so that was kind of how I got hooked. And then I ended up being like, whoa, this is like a really cool world. I should spend more time on this. And so I ended up taking sort of like a hard left turn, went to Square for my first sort of summer internship, which ended up being, quite impactful, for my career in a variety of ways. Just like learned for the first time. I was like, well, one, I'm ready to do startups. Like I'd been coding since I was in like 5th grade. And so, at Square, I was like one of the better Android engineers. And I was like, okay, do I really need more schooling? Like, why am I paying so much money for something where like I already know how to do the job? And so love that. And then also too, just learned like, wow, there's these people like Jack Dorsey where it's like, this guy is a fucking like legend, just like a, beast of a human being in terms of like just how quickly he moves, how much he changes the world, the stories that he tells. And I was like, I just have to be out here. Like I cannot get stuck back in Boston again, like doing these like cryptography, like, problems, need to actually go build stuff. And then also that summer, watched the COO at the time, Keith Raboy, give this presentation that just like sort of blew my mind. He basically showed for the first time like why Square basically like went flat as opposed to growing 20% month over month for the first time in its history. And he did it with this like very clever analysis, which like at the time I was like, oh my God, this is like statistical wizardry. Now as a relatively experienced VC/founder, it was a cohort analysis, but still when you like never seen a cohort analysis, you're like, whoa, that's like magic. Yeah. And I remember just thinking like, wow, I want to do what that guy's doing. Like I want to apply like statistics and math to the world of business and like figure out how to do that. And so I ended up happening to be sort of like roommates with a guy that was like friends with a Teal fellow that kind of told me about that program that summer. So I went to a couple of like Teal fellowship events and I was like, okay, I found my path. Like I'm going to learn from Keith. I'm going to like, figure out how to do this Teal fellowship thing. I'm going to get the hell out of MIT. And so went back to MIT basically that fall with this plan. I was like, I got to come up with a startup idea that I can apply with. I took a couple of like this sort of MBA classes at MIT. It's like healthcare ventures class. Ended up basically coming up with a startup idea, applying for the TL fellowship, eventually getting it, dropping out of school. Basically worked on that, startup for, about 3.5, 4 years. It was basically like a sort of like half electronic medical record, half kind of like workflow tool for behavioral and speech therapists, primarily for use in like early childhood autism therapy. And so we ended up like doing decently, like we, got into Y Combinator, raised like a 600K, like, sort of small seed round, got to, I'd say at our peak, we were probably around like, 12 to 15K MRR, somewhere sort of in that range. It was like, for two 19-year-old MIT dropouts, like sort of decently ramen profitable. But, at some point we kind of flatlined, mostly because it turns out like two 19-year-old CS dropouts aren't particularly good at like distribution or like enterprise healthcare sales. And so after kind of banging our head against the walls for a while, eventually like got some feedbacks from some, mentors and friends who were like, look, you gave it a good go. Like 4 years is a good amount of time to like dedicate towards this, but like you should maybe consider like doing something else and trying out other things. And so got that advice. And then Keith had tried to give me that advice many times, but I'd always kind of refused to listen to him. He had basically, through when I dropped out for the Teal Fellowship, I reached out to him to be sort of like a mentor of mine through the Teal Fellowship. And he was trying to convince me to join Open Door. And I was like, no, it's ridiculous. Your startup's dumb. My startup's cool. Turns out his startup was actually a lot cooler.
How was that conversation? Talk to me about, when you're like Open Door, who the fuck wants to buy houses on the internet? Was that your rebuttal to the business model, or was there like other, aspects of it that you just didn't believe in?
I think it was more just like...
Because plot twist, people were buying houses on the internet.
Exactly. People are. I think it was that, like, I just got this feedback when I was, like, 18 from a couple of just, like, startup friends of mine that were just like, Delian, you, like, hop from idea to idea, like, week to week. You're never sticking on one particular thing. Like, you just can't build up a career in tech unless, like, you kind of focus in on one problem. And so it was less of, like, feedback on, like, the business model or team, et cetera. It was more just, like, Keith, I told myself I was going to work on this very particular problem for a minimum of, like, 4 years. And I wasn't going to give up until 4 years. And, like, you're catching me at year 2, not year 4. And so
are you structured that way, like just you personally, that's how you roll? Or
it just felt like basically like if you study all the really great startups, like even those that like are in cockroach mode, et cetera, like have some difficulties, it felt like by year 4 they were at least like on an escape trajectory, or like they weren't. And so it kind of felt like, again, it was like maybe somewhat arbitrary, but it felt like the appropriate amount of time where I was like, as a whatever 18-year-old, 4 years is going to be like a significant chunk of my life. Nobody can question like whether or not I have the ability to like dedicate myself towards something. Like I want to clearly show that and like show resiliency and like sort of like banging down doors and like figuring out problems. So yeah, it was more of like a just stubborn 20-year-old being like, fuck you, Keith, I don't care about your startup, I don't want to join anything, I'm doing my thing. But then it was a friend of Keith's actually in some way that eventually like convinced me like, hey, I know you're not gonna like listen to Keith when he tells you this, but let me give you the same advice. Like you are approaching year 4 now. Like the analogy that he uses, like, Delian, you clearly are a very smart individual, you're tackling these things the right way, but like you just might not have the right product and the right market and the right timing, which I kind of agree with. Actually, we now funded a company that I kind of sometimes jokingly call like Nightingale 2.0. Like it's growing really, really well. And in some ways I look at it and I'm like, yeah, actually like for the world of digital health and like autism therapy, like 2020 is just like a much better timing for that startup than like 2014 was. And so the whole analogy that he gave me was just like, Delian, you should put yourself in a highly leveraged position. Right now you only have a limited amount of leverage. Like there's only so much you can do with 600K. Consider the fact that you have friends that could put you into higher leverage positions. And so I ended up deciding to sort of unwind the company and basically got this offer to join as the VP of growth at this company, Teespring, which at the time was sort of had been a super high growth, high flying startup in like sort of the 2014, 2015 timeframe. Like, big fundraising rounds. Keith like led a $20 million Series B, joined the board. But the company was starting to sort of see flat/declining revenues.
And what was the model? What was Teespring?
Oh yeah, so Teespring is sort of like a competitor to like Custom Ink, Redbubble, basically just like an online t-shirt customizer and like merch producer. But their whole thing was just like making the just like merch design interface a lot easier and like a lot more custom and things that you could do with it, and just making it much more like mobile friendly, just kind of like Custom Ink like rethought. And so it exploded initially. They originally just grew off of like the backs of like what they called these like Facebook sellers. So they would make shirts that were like, Maria, the woman, the myth, the legend. And then like they would advertise to people named Maria. Yeah, exactly. You probably
it's on sale on the Miami Tech Pod website.
You probably should have gone on the one that said Brian.
No.
But then they would advertise to people named Maria, and like they would sell like crazy because it turns out like some subset of people would really like it, but then also some subset of Marias got really creeped out because they're like, whoa, this is like an ad for a shirt on my Facebook feed. It knows my name. Like this is creepy. And so Facebook started to clamp this stuff down. And so that's basically why Teespring started to like have this hyper growth and then started to have declining. And because of that, there's no way I could have been a VP of growth at like a hot flying, super fast growing startup. But Teespring was kind of a little bit in like recovery mode, and they were kind of willing to take a bet on like, let's give this like failed founder that Keith's recommending we hire, see what he can do with some resources. So yeah, that was kind of where I feel like I learned a lot more of just like, I don't know, more broad strategic views, really got pushed. I had to report to Keith on a weekly basis, an executive, which was like very different than like some Joe Schmo random small startup like angel investment that he'd done. Like this was like his biggest check. And so it was like a different level of like, I had to make like the equivalent of like board slides basically, almost
How old
every
were you?
week. I joined when I was like 22 and a half or something like that. And basically stayed for about a year.
Was this your first like big management job?
Yeah, so I like joined and like there was like probably 3 or 4 marketers on the team. There was like maybe 8 or 9 engineers, 1 product manager, and 1 designer total across the team.
Well, that's not that wasn't that very big considering how much like attention Teespring was getting back then.
That was just the team that I was responsible for.
Okay.
So it was in total 300 person organization.
That makes more
I was
sense.
given this like sort of like, hey, let's give
Yeah.
them this kind of like project. It was basically like the marketplace project of like typically Teespring was like people would come in, make these shirts, and like they would sell it directly. And we were basically trying to take all these individual like campaigns and make a marketplace around it. This guy Jesse had joined before me, had kind of gotten it to like I think like on the order of like 8 to 9 million of revenue a year, and they basically handed it to me and they're like, look, this thing's going. It's got like a nascent team. Figure out what you can do with it. And so managed to grow that over my time there from like I think I started out maybe somewhere between 9 to 12 million annualized and got it up to like about 75 or so when I left. And so managed to grow it roughly like 6x over the course of the year. But had some different views on sort of where the company should head vis-a-vis the sort of CEO and how to prioritize that. And so after about a year or so was like, okay, I feel sort of like well rested enough, it's time to go back to like, I'd always been like, I'm going to be a founder. I'm going to build companies. I'm going to build them. I have to be the CEO. And so I was like, I'm ready to be the CEO of like the next thing. And so was playing around with a couple different ideas, had a co-founding team sort of for one of them. The other 2 co-founders kind of decided to go do a different model. And so, kind of was stuck on an island again. And I was like, fuck, I do want to leave Teespring right now. I'm like ready to build something, but like I'm broke and I don't have like the resources to just go work on an idea on the side, like, which I do. And I was kind of telling this to Keith one night. And he was like, why don't you come join me at Coastal Ventures? You can do kind of like a little bit of an EIR role, a little bit of chief of staff. Promise me that you'll stay for a year, but you can use this as like your base to like, figure out sort of like what you want to work on. And then, about like, 6 or 7 months in, I sort of had this sudden realization where I was like, I'm super ADD. I'm super intellectually curious. I like bouncing all over the place. I don't deal with like low sleep and high stress particularly well. And like, I actually like, I'm a pretty good sort of like confidant / like therapist, but I'm not as good of like a quote unquote manager. I was like, these things are all like extreme cons as a founder. Like if you want to be a founding CEO, like
Right.
you got to be able to do all those things pretty damn well. And like I could force myself to get better at those things, but like the feedback that I always given to people was like, you should lean into your strengths, not try to mitigate your weaknesses. And so I basically was like, well, what can I do that has all those strengths? And I was like, well, it seems like VC likes all these things. They like ADD. They like people that are like better therapists. They like intellectual curiosity. They like people that like to context switch. And so I was like, maybe I should actually like consider doing the VC thing. Because like if I, work the equivalent amount, maybe I can be a top 15 or 20% founder. But I think the equivalent for VC, I could maybe be a top 1% VC because it comes more naturally to me. And so kind of had this, I don't know, like refocus or, shift where I was like, okay, maybe I don't need to be like founder, CEO. And so I started like, I was just like doing the chief of staff role for Keith. And then I was like, okay, that would like end most days like 3:30, 4 p.m. And then I'd just like spend the nights and weekends. Like I'm just going to do what Keith did, but try and do it on my own. And steadily kind of, sourced in a couple of investments that Coastal Ventures ended up doing. And then, kind of kept doing that. And then eventually basically Keith switched over to Founders Fund and basically requested that that I move over, with him. And so moved over to Founders Fund, continue to sort of invest in seed, Series A, the occasional sort of later stage company, mostly focused on sort of like engineering based investing. So like, consumer hardware, satellites, kind of all over the place. And then, COVID hit and that changed a lot of things in my life. 1, Founders Fund basically stopped investing. 2, space kept moving forward, in particular launch costs. And so this idea that I've been noodling on for like almost a decade, it's like funny now that like Varda's launched, sometimes I'll like get texts from like an old high school friend from like sophomore year. They'll be like, oh yeah, you actually pitched this to me like sophomore year at a party. And I'm like, oh, I did not, like, I didn't even realize I was thinking about it for that long. In some ways, it's just like one of these ideas that you have on the shelf for so long, you don't even realize. But I all of a sudden had all this free time. I was like, well, maybe it's time to start taking that idea on the shelf seriously. Let me like kind of put together that founding team, do it. And so from like, July through January was really primarily July of 2020 through like January of 21 was really primarily focused on, Varda putting that together, but with the perspective of like, I know that I'm a bad CEO, so I'm going to go find a good CEO. And so thankfully, did manage to do that and found a great chief scientist, put together that team, the business plan, raised about, $9 million in our seed round. We've taken on some more sort of since then that we haven't announced yet.
So we all know what Varda is, but why don't you kind of share for the listeners at home as if this was your pitch, right? Like as if, you were sitting across from investors, which, I mean, we're investors, but,
Yeah, so Varda is making the world's first space factories. To try to sort of break that down a bit, there's basically a series of materials that are very valuable for us here on Earth. Everything from human organs to semiconductors to fiber optic cables.
Human organs.
Yeah, so the physics of this is actually one of the easiest ones to understand. So we have the technologies already to sort of do, sort of cellular or 3D printing today here on Earth. But the problem is if you try to do it in the shape of a human heart, human hearts have particularly thin walls. They have complex, sort of ventricles. And so as you start to print it, it just basically starts to flop over. Versus in space, there's no flopping over because there's no gravity. So that's maybe like the sort of simple high-level explanation, but different types of materials like semiconductors and fiber optics sort of have a similar principle where basically like the lack of gravity makes it so you can control the process in a much more fine-tuned way that creates much, much higher quality materials. This has been well proven out on the International Space Station over the past decade, including multiple experiments that one of my co-founders has done, our chief scientist. And so it's sort of ready to be commercially scaled. Launch costs are now cheap enough where you can afford to sort of send the raw materials up there, fabricate them in space, bring it back down. But nobody was really doing that, partially because a lot of people were afraid of sort of, the thing that's nice about the ISS is you sort of get a free ride up and a free ride down. Yeah. And so doing it independent of the ISS seems kind of scary. It is easy to get a ride up, right? SpaceX, Rocket Lab, plenty of ways to go up.
Maria goes all the time.
Goes to space all the time. Easy to go. But coming back down from space is actually like a lot harder than people think. It's not, you're going pretty damn fast, and entering the atmosphere is a painful problem.
So is what you're telling us that Peter Thiel secretly has his own space station that we don't know about?
I'll beat him to the space station, I think.
Right.
So we'll see, though. I don't know if he's a big space guy. But yeah, so sort of put together that founding team, raised that money, and then it was funny because at the same time, we started to feel just like extreme frustrations with sort of San Francisco's local politics and some of the policies that were getting passed. I'd been really active in the sort of 2019 district attorney local race, sort of campaign for one of the individuals, hosted like the biggest like fundraising events for him, tried to get a lot of like my colleagues and friends activated, but everyone's like, the district attorney, why does this matter? Who is this? And I was like, I'm telling you, there's this crazy guy, Cesar, if he gets like put into the district attorney, it's going to be bad. And lo and behold, people didn't really seem to pay much attention. And so Cesar got elected mostly because, Bernie Sanders sent out a text like 24 hours before the election, which totally swung all of the votes and polls and everything. And Cesar, over the course of 2020, and in particular during COVID, was like truly making the city into like a war zone. It was just like no persecution of criminals. Like in areas that I felt perfectly safe before, started to feel terrible. The parts of the city that like already weren't particularly great pre-COVID, literally like at this point like look almost like war zones. Like there's just like camps everywhere. There's people that are literally like dying in the streets. There's no helping provided to them, and it's just like absolutely horrific. And so was feeling a lot of frustrations with the city and with the policies around masking and like outdoor dining. And then on this particular day in December where I was like in the depths of like the stress of like the Varda fundraise and getting this thing closed, and like the thing that had been keeping me going was like at least I could go to my local neighborhood restaurant each night and like have a bite to eat and kind of like hang out and like see some like lively energy. And on like whatever it was, December 10th 2020, San Francisco decides to shut down outdoor dining, despite there being no science behind this, and like there being literally no evidence of outdoor spread. I was like, this is like fucking ridiculous. This makes absolutely no sense. And this is like the one thing that's keeping people sane. And by the way, this is going to be counterproductive because all these people are just going to go hang out indoors. Like, what do you think is going to happen? People are social creatures. They're not going to all just like sit and lock down again for another infinite amount of time after you've allowed them to have outdoor dining, because everybody sort of reestablished that they're like willing to be somewhat more social. And so I remember I was literally like sitting in the bathroom thinking about this and was frustrated. And I'd sort of been like somewhat critiquing like Keith's move to Miami like a month prior, being like, oh my God, like he's just retiring. Like, how can he do this? And I was like, to me, it was funny. It was like a very pithy tweet that was somewhat of like a extremely heavily laden with like sarcasm. It was basically like, oh my God, San Francisco's so terrible. Like, what do you guys think if we just like picked up Silicon Valley and moved it to Miami? And then, that tweet sort of took a life of its own, especially once the mayor, like a couple hours later, quote tweeted with, how can I help? Not even realizing that like, that's a phrase that I guess he used all the time, but in like Silicon Valley, it's like the thing that like people always make fun of VCs for saying, because it's like sort of an empty phrase. Like when you pass and don't want to invest, the way that you kind of feel like, assuage your guilt is like you tell the founder, how can I help? And then if they ask you for any help, you just fucking like ditch the meeting as quickly as possible, right? And so he quote tweets that this was like, how can I help? And I was like, oh my God, this is so funny. And of course, like it just explodes within like the VC community, because it's like, look at this, the mayor like, wants to help, but it's also funny because he's like talking like a VC, blah, blah. And so that tweet ended up getting covered by like CNN, Washington Post, like, kind of all over the place. And I remember just thinking at the time, I was like, wow, that's crazy. Like, I'm not really moving to Miami anytime soon, but it's kind of cool that like this tweet went viral, you know, but I was like, I got to build this space company. It's in California. Like, I don't know how I would like manage to like move across the country. It makes no sense. Like, I don't.
Had you been to Miami before that?
I'd been, but like on like, you know, kind of like the Vegas equivalent trips of like, you know, go directly to South Beach, like, you know, get drunk off my ass for like 3 days in a row and be like, I got to leave. This is like, this place is crazy, right? Never like really like mainland Miami, which is a very obviously different part of Miami.
But you can't, the great thing about living here is like you can do that whenever you want. Like you could actually like locals are just like there's an on switch, and you know, like tonight we're gonna rage, and right, like isn't that the neat kind of optionality you have now?
We get a weekly text from Cesar. Says rage question mark.
You up?
Yeah, I find, you know, some of my San Francisco friends have asked me like, how's life here? And I'm like, I actually find like I work harder here than I did in San Francisco. Yeah. Partially it's like a little bit like the time zones of like I get here at like, you know, 8:30 in the morning and I end up staying kind of later than I would in San Francisco because like there's the PST time frame. But then also part of it is that like there's at least like a reward at the end of the grind. Whereas like if I want to go to Mila at like 8 p.m. on a Wednesday, I can both get a reservation. It's going to be like fucking fun. There's going to be good food. And it's like, I'm not as much of like a 11 or Space or, you know,
is Mila your spot?
I love the like, you know, like the
It's
Milas,
so
the Socialistas, like the La Jolla beaches, like the kind of like, you know, lounge, but there's still music and there's like dancers or whatever. And like,
you like the Mykonos vibe.
Yes. Oh my God. I love Mykonos. Like and Namos in Mykonos is like my favorite like lounge type club. And like Mila's as close as I can get to Namos. If you could combine
they have
Jolla,
the same furniture.
It literally actually does feel like the same furniture. If you could combine like Jolla Beach, you know, plus like Mila, you would literally have that because like Namos is all about like literally like the people park their yachts, you know, take the little boat out to Namos. You have a very fancy, almost like Michelin star dinner, and then like exactly at like 7:30 p.m. everybody starts clubbing in the middle of the restaurant.
I've been. It's great.
Yeah, Namos is great. And so that makes it worth it when the next morning you wake up and you're like, well, honestly, I'm feeling pretty energized to grind another 12 hours because I've got a lot of vitamin D in me. I had a great night last night and like had great food and like smiled and laughed and like hung out with friends. Like I just smile more here, and it turns out smiling more makes you more productive. And so it's a pretty simple equation.
So the tweet goes out, all this craziness. Then what? What was Keith like? Get on a flight right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's a handful of people. The mayor like slid into my DMs like, when are you coming? When are you visiting? And I was like, dude, I literally like, we have like 11 engineers that are starting full time in like Torrance, California, like January 19th. Like, I don't have the time to think about like visiting Miami right now. Like I can't, it's like not in my mental headspace. Like we need to like launch this company basically. And like I spent most of January in LA. I wasn't even like in San Francisco, you know, for Founders Fund. And then, you know, after we sort of got the engineers a little bit more settled in, I started doing these like weekly trips to LA, and I was like, okay, this feels like a, you know, reasonable cadence. And then basically Keith was doing like a birthday sort of party here in Miami in like late March. And I was like, okay, you know, it's going to be like after our first board meeting, you know, it'll be a good chance to like, you know, go and check out what's happening here. But again, like there's no way that I'd possibly move. I remember like having dinner with a friend right beforehand. He's like, would you ever move? I'm like, no, dude, like I can't, like got the company in California, all of, like the founders I feel like are all here, et cetera. Like there's just no way. And then I came out for that week to like hang out with Keith. And I remember I even did a cafecito with the mayor on like the Monday that I was here. And he again asked me the question, would you move? And I was like, no, sorry. Like, I don't think it's going to be possible, blah, blah, blah. And then over the course of the week, like a variety of different things happened. My girlfriend at the same time also was sort of falling in love with Miami for, you know, separate set of reasons. But there's a couple different things that hit me at once. The first was venture investing has just like fundamentally changed, and it's never going to go back. Samil Shah, the like, you know, GP at Haystack, I think like literally tweeted this morning. He was like, you know, as much as I'm, you know, immunized and ready to go, these like pesky founders still want a fundraiser resume. And it's like, yeah, I've been on the other side of the table recently. There's no way I'm going back to like driving around Sand Hill Road or the Bay Area, meeting with like these VCs in person that have like limited interest in our business. Like, no way. It's so much more advantageous to parallel track or resume. And like when things get serious and you're debating who to add to your board, then you can go to the in-person. But that's like 2 or 3 people, not like the wine or top of funnel thing. And so investing has fundamentally changed. A significant portion of it is going to be over Zoom. Then, by the way, for that last part of the funnel, for like, you know, who they want to add to the board, I'm having way more success like convincing people to fly to Miami than I ever was to the Bay Area. Because like Miami's fun to visit for a weekend. If like some, you know, if a founder, you know, hears from me that like, hey, Founders Fund will like, you know, buy you a ticket and like we would love to have you out here for the weekend, most of them honestly say yes to that. That sounds like pretty fun. And so there was a part of it that was like, you know, investing has clearly changed. That part's possible to be done over the Zoom. And then the third part of it was I went to this particular party that Lucy Guo and Christian Garrett from 137 Ventures were co-hosting that week. And I remember just like walking into the room and just seeing like, I was like, there are more top tier venture capitalists and founders literally in this room than I've seen in San Francisco in a single place in like years and years. Like they used to congregate in like San Francisco. Like there used to be, I remember these like super fun like pool parties like back in like 2015, 16 that were like ostentatious, gregarious, like super fun. But then people started writing like books about them and articles, and then people started getting canceled for like having too cool of parties. And so at some point all those things died down, and so San Francisco just like didn't, like people wouldn't aggregate in one place, and so you'd have to do all these like one-off coffee chats. But it's not the same of like, I sometimes joke like, yeah, these like parties kind of maybe seem ridiculous, but like literally from the party that Founders Fund did in like Miami Tech Week, whatever, now like 3 weeks ago, I know multiple investments that have come out of it, like multiple large corporate partnerships. Like these things are like, yes, they're fun, but like the reason you do it is because of those spontaneous like connections and collaborations that end up happening, and that just like didn't exist anymore in San Francisco. And I was like, oh my god, this exists here. And part of the reason why is like, one, Miami is very comfortable with being ostentatious, but then two, just like the venues are more cool too. Like it turns out a house in the Venetian Islands is like way cooler than like Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, and so people show up to them. And I remember literally like I walked in the party, and it was funny, like everything just like hit me at once, where I was just like, oh my god, I've made 3 investments this week. I've done just as many Zoom calls in the same way that I would. And I'm seeing all these VCs here, and I remember I like almost like instinctually, I didn't even like think the thought. I like just literally blurted out. I was like, "There's no fucking way I can get on that return flight." And then I said it, I think kind of like half as a joke, but then like once it had exited my mouth, and like I turned to my friend that heard me say it. He's like, "Same." He was also in San Francisco. He's like, now moved his whole company here, and I was like, "Oh my god." I don't know what's going on here. Am I moving to Miami? I think I'm moving to Miami, I guess. Like, I did not think that this is how this week was going to end. And so my girlfriend had been like off doing a road thing with some of her local Miami friends. They were like actually in Disney World. And so she was gone for like this was like on a Thursday night. She was gone for like whatever, Wednesday, Thursday. And then like Friday, we were like meeting up for dinner with a bunch of friends. And we had to like, she like arrived like right before dinner. We had to like rush, get ready, go straight to the restaurants. Like didn't really get to chat much. And so, I was more like kind of like noodling on it. I was like, and then I just remember seeing my girlfriend just like the happiest I'd seen her, the just like tan, just like absolutely looking beautiful. And then she like turns to me and is like, Delian, like, I think I want to spend like more time here in Miami. I'm like happier here. My friends are here. Like everything that I want to do is here. And then I just like, I was like, let's just move to Miami. And she was like, you want to, because like she just assumed, she was like, she had been like thinking about this conversation the whole day, being like, oh my God, I need to sit down Delian. This is going to be like a serious thing. He's been so long in San Francisco. How am I going to convince him to like spend like a month or 2 here so we can actually like maybe split our time and I can be happier? Whereas I was like, my girlfriend's hotter here. She's happier here. I'm like working harder. Like, great, let's just move to Miami. And so that was on Friday night. And then we had like a whole packed day already Saturday, but went to bed pretty early Saturday night. Woke up Sunday morning, like early in the morning, asked Keith to borrow like sort of like one of his Vespas. And we were like, okay, let's figure out like where we're going to live in the city. Like, where would we move hypothetically, as we figure out, do we lease, do we buy, what are we going to do? And so we literally just like started like literally from basically like here in Brickell and literally went block by block, like, through Brickell, through like Little Jamaica, through like Overtown, everything. And eventually made our way all the way up to like Design District. We're like, oh my God, I love Design District. Like this is my kind of neighborhood. It's got all these great restaurants, super walkable, but like Buena Vista East there is also like super suburban. Like I like this in some ways like way more than any of the
We all live in the area.
Nice.
So Morningside, Midtown, Miami Shores, we're all in the kind of...
I love that area.
Big
like
fans
it's just,
of me,
Morningside, etc., all great. And then literally like we were just Vesping by this open house and we were like, oh, this house looks beautiful. It's super modern, looks recently renovated. Like knocked on the door. They're like, open house is an hour. I was like, okay, like, if we're going to go to this open house, let's like check out some of the other ones, checked out a couple others. I think there's like literally one other one that was actually available. And then went back to the original one, walked in, and within like 3 minutes of walking in the house, my girlfriend and I turned to each other. We're like, we're buying this fucking house. Like I thought we were just exploring, but no, we're buying this particular house because like I like it. And we put in the bid the next day and had it accepted. And so,
well, congrats on
Yeah,
thank you.
We've last pod we talked about Miami real estate quite a bit, and it's getting hot. It's kind of crazy.
Brian's in the process. He just sold his house and bought another house.
Yeah. We had an offer from someone who didn't even set foot in the house. They just saw it online. They're like, in cash. Like,
okay.
So, yeah.
What has been your, you definitely walked us through the journey of like how you got here and all of that, but how are you like assimilating here? Like, how do you see yourself here long term, or is this kind of a temporary thing, or are you not thinking about it? How do you?
Yeah, I mean, I always think that like with these types of big life decisions, I think most people just like really spend too much time overthinking and overanalyzing them, and like you get stuck in this like 6-month stasis period where like you're debating this life. Versus like I tend to believe just like make the decision, and then you actually just get to make more decisions over the course of your life and just like live more of life. And so yeah, I'm really, really enjoying it. And like, I am happier here. I'm healthier here. It's like more sun. My office is here and the people that I work with are here. And I get to also spend the week a month in like, LA working on Varda. And I've also had these like all these unintended benefits that I didn't really realize where it's like, I didn't really choose Miami because of Space Coast being here, but actually for Varda related things, it's been extremely relevant. And then also Miami being a swing state means a lot of the like politicians that I need to meet with in relation for Varda work are also coming through here. So there's been like all these unintended, benefits. So yeah, I mean, for some reason, there's somewhere else that like, also makes sense for me. I will like, happily move as well, but there's nothing that immediately stands out.
You had a great tweet the other day, Brian, which is like, never would you have imagined that people would come here to raise money.
That's true. It's true. Like back when I first started Refresh Miami back in 2006 or whatever, a bunch of my friends raised money and then they were told by their investors, come to California, right? All those companies died. All of them. And it's not the fault of the founders. It's like they came out, they had a burn rate that was Miami rated, right? And then all of a sudden you're thrown into San Francisco where the costs are 50% higher and you don't have more money. Like your employees are going to burn out fast, And so like they all learned their lessons, right? And then when they raised money again in San Francisco or back in Miami, they knew to raise either more or less or whatever and calibrate, But look, I'm so shocked that I get DMs on a weekly basis. I think today I had 3 of random founders who I've never met saying, I'm coming to Miami to raise money. And that's mind-blowing to me. Like, I can't believe that this is even a reality,
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've changed my bar at all for like who I'm willing to meet in person or like, between San Francisco and Miami. Yeah. But I have like a lot of in-person meetings here, and it's like it is actually in some ways, even shocking to me. Of like even some of our partners when like we were moving, we're critiquing. They're like, look, the job of being a VC is like be where the founders are and wherever they're doing fundraising trips. And they're like, there's no way the founders are going to stop by Miami for a fundraise. I now regularly I had a founder that like literally came from Europe and is like 2 stops in all of like the United States where like he stopped by San Francisco for a week and then he came to Miami for a week. And it's because like at this point like not everybody tweets about it, but like if you look at like I say seed Series A, not quite there yet, but for Series B and beyond, there are more Series B and beyond leads in Miami than literally anywhere else in the United States right now. You can try to argue your way out of it, but like, look, at the end of the day, these crossover funds that have entered into venture capital deploy way more dollars than like the venture capitalists do, and all those guys are here. Not necessarily all of them tweet about it and have like had articles about it, but if you want to meet with D1, Tiger, Edition, Co2, etc., like Miami is currently like the place to do so, and those guys are the ones that are leading all the Series B's, C's, and D's, and so founders are recognizing that, and like in the grand scheme of things, like it is actually useful to, like I don't think founders need to all congregate in one area, like I think that has gotten dispersed, but I do think there is advantages to VCs all being in one area, partially because founders do want to meet their board members in person. It's more advantageous to be able to fly to one place. And there's also some amount of like what I call like the fraternization with the enemy of like, when my investments are going well, but I already own as much of the company as I would like to own, there is something to be said around just being able to casually catch up with like a VC at a party and they ask me like, okay, which ones are your top performing ones? And I'm honest with them of like, here's the ones that are going well, here's the ones that are not. But for the ones that are going well, it does make their next fundraiser super easy where it's like, that investor already knows about them. They know that Delian thinks it's going well, and like that actually like helps catalyze a round. And so I know of many rounds that have come together from starting from maybe that Miami Tech Week party to like people that have had coffee and Panther Coffee, and it's like there are more deals happening in person here than I think probably anywhere in the world right now.
Really one awesome. Of the things that I'm really excited about is how like the movement of all these people from New York, San Francisco has actually like lit a fire under the ass of the local angels. Will probably want to admit this, but like back when he was first raising, the kind of deals that the local angels were offering were like atrocious, sharky. Yeah, it was offensive. Like they'd be like, oh, $50,000 for 25% of your company. You're like, what the fuck am I supposed to do with that? Like, so I'm supposed to just like commit seppuku on my company like right now?
Like I'll hire part-time one engineer part-time to
part-time in Argentina, not even in Miami.
Dev shop in Argentina.
I heard a story the other day by a founder who was like, when I tried to raise from years ago in San Francisco, people wouldn't invest in me if I had Miami investors on my cap table because they knew that they were sharky and they didn't want to deal with that. And I was like, I had no idea.
Name names, Maria. Name names.
He didn't drop names, but I'm sure we could all come up with a few.
No, but look, this makes the environment more founder friendly.
Yeah.
The reality is that the more money that's sloshing around, and there's also more FOMO amongst the local investor crowd too, because they're like, shit, all these people are billionaires. We're not billionaires yet. We got to do what they're doing. And there's this whole chasing of that sort of excitement and all that. So
like you said, I think rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Yeah.
Boats, like there's more competition, and so I think it's like great to see. Like I think it will take time to see the impacts of this, right? It's not going to like happen overnight, but like, look, there's somebody that tweeted today that did like a rough study, and I don't think they're totally off, that there's like literally 50,000 new jobs that are going to be created.
That was me who tweeted.
Oh, that was you. Okay, sorry. I'm repeating your own tweet to you. Anyways, I think that is like roughly an accurate analysis, but like I'm doing the rough math on just like the companies that I know that are moving here. For sure, it's going to take time where it's like they're not like, we have one that's like about to announce that they're opening an office here like in a couple weeks. It's like, okay, well, like they're opening the office and then they got to announce it, and then like they're getting the space in October, and then people will all start to move in. And like, like a year and a half from now, they'll probably have 200, 300 people.
And then they have to deal with the building permit department.
Exactly, with the permit expediters.
The permit expediters.
But one of the things to that point that people don't realize is like in all the economic development studies, they show that like for every one tech job, it creates 4 non-tech jobs, right? So if there's 50,000 new jobs, that means there's like, I don't know, 200,000 other jobs that come to Miami. And like, that's a huge percentage of our population, and that raises so many people into better paying jobs and things like that. So,
and there's like this low key large pool of remote workers here in tech that, when they're like, okay, I vested year 3, let me do the next thing. Oh shit, there's a VP of whatever, or PM job here, like in Miami, like might as well, right? It's down the street. And I think that's the piece that I feel like excited about, which is like there is talent here, right? Like it doesn't necessarily need to be for like a company with 100,000 square foot of office space, but there's talent here, right? And we'll see that continue to compound, I guess, into other companies in a cool way.
There's also, we're seeing this with a couple of our portfolio companies where there's just such extreme demand for like San Francisco engineers that want to move right now to the Bay Area, but there isn't like a massive supply of companies that can absorb them. And so for the ones that are announcing Miami offices are getting literally like their pick of the litter. Like this local Miami company that I was like, referencing earlier that we haven't announced yet, they've been in Miami for, now 4 or 5 years. Had never had much success, recruiting or, convincing people to move from the Bay Area to here. Versus now they're like, we're like literally, senior engineers at, Uber, Airbnb, et cetera, like are like begging us to come here, are happy to take pay cuts, et cetera. Cause like they're just so like desperate to get the hell out of Dodge and like, come to Miami. And so it's exciting to see that like, I think that, it's another example of sort of not only will the terms get better for founders, but also not only is the local talent here growing from hiring, but also like your ability to like import higher and higher levels of talent is only continuing to increase.
So talk to us about your portfolio. What do those companies look like? Who are the ones you're excited about, working with that you're really bullish on?
Yeah, so we have a decent number that are like now down here in Miami. I'd say the ones that are, have announced, 8 Sleep is obviously, down here and is maybe a prototypical like example portfolio company of mine of like, I tend to, like things that are not just what I call pure bit-based companies. So I'm not the best person for like a consumer social or like enterprise SaaS, something like that, like pure software. I like things that involve software, hardware, operations, deep tech type things. Yeah. And so, they're a perfect example of this, right? Of like the software is really key to creating a thermoregulating bed, but obviously like as is the hardware.
You have to be good at both.
Yeah, you have to be good at both in order to like pull that off. And it's like hard to do, but we like, these more complex things. I also really like investing in like more like regulated areas. So for example, this like company that we're announcing is like an insurtech thing. And like one of our fastest growing New York things is like a fintech thing. And so like these areas that like most other VCs are a little bit fearful of versus, honestly, partially from Keith's sort of like legal background, have a much more nuanced understanding of like sort of which regulations matter, which ones you can take risk on, which ones you can't.
Also, that's the space I work in. It's moat building, right?
Exactly. If you can figure it out, it's very hard for others to come in and figure out, especially if you take a very like unique, sort of net new, approach. And then for sure, obviously with Varda, aerospace is a significant focus of mine, and it's been relevant for here on Space Coast, right? We're like, one of the companies that I funded, Hadrian, recently, I described them as sort of like the flex port for aerospace and defense machine shops. Like they actually run their own like machine shops, but they have to be wherever the space companies are. And so their first factory for sure is in LA, but the second factory is probably going to be in the Miami area. It'll take probably 1.5 years, 2 years or something. But I think that we will start to see some more of these deep tech companies coming down here. Cause like it used to be that like, it was more like in the Orlando areas, like where there was like a handful of offices. Sure. And then people only really came here for like mission operations, like when things would actually launch. But now that you have the VCs here, like I actually think that you'll see a lot more deep tech companies also starting to base their offices here. Whereas I'd say so far there haven't been too many. I'd say they're more like traditional tech is what's been most likely to move down here first. But yeah, so aerospace, bits and atoms. I like industrial automation, robotics, construction. Anything that is just like, I don't know, got some like real like meat to it. I like to assess that, partially because like I tend to think as an investor, you always want to look for like what is your competitive advantage, right? If it's something that's a pure SaaS thing, like what advantage do I have? Like anybody can kind of evaluate SaaS honestly at this point, versus like with my kind of computer science, robotics, aerospace background, like most people can't assess a Varda or a Hadrian or Regent, this like eVTOL thing that I did recently. So
Do you buy into the Mark Cuban SaaS is a dead business model mentality?
I think that SaaS companies will still make a lot of revenue and generate a lot of value for the world. I think that there is pretty limited alpha at this point for investors to invest in. Like I think, companies like, Miami-based, Pipe are going to make it really hard for venture investors to be able to generate significant returns from like SaaS companies in the future. And so I have this tweet that I've, sometimes repeat on some regular basis that, sort of the returns in the 2010s were primarily based off of the world of bits, and that the returns in the 2020s are going to be primarily based off the world of atoms. And so I think it's going to force a lot more people to take, in some ways, to me, much more exciting risks. Like, the exciting risks in 2020 were like, can this person like run a data center and like build a mobile app? And it's like, okay, at this point we figured out a lot of people know how to like run data centers and build mobile apps. Now it's like you see a lot more VCs having to like delve into, can this person like build a rocket or build a spaceship or build, space factories? And so I love seeing that like more people are sort of getting forced into this ecosystem because like that's the place where the returns are.
Awesome. This was very, very neat. Thanks for joining us, Delian. This was a fascinating conversation. Our first in-person pod. You made some history on the Miami Tech Pod here. But look, we really appreciate your perspective and your time. And whenever you want to join on the pod again to either plug something or rebut, you know where to find us. And we really appreciate it to all of our listeners, the folks following us on Twitter. This was episode 20 of the Miami Tech Pod, and we will see you next week.